Hi everyone, good afternoon everyone. Special hello to all my MPAConnect friends. I miss you all. Hi to all the new friends and experts who are joining us today, and thank you all for being with us. Let me share my screen. Alize has said so much good stuff, and it is a huge pleasure to be able to follow on from her. What I'm going to do is I want to tell you a little bit about the lessons that MPAConnect has learned on tools and mechanisms for sustainable financing of coral rescue. We know that financing is the critical topic for everybody. The MPA managers that I work with constantly tell us that the number one priority need is sustainable financing, which means that it's reliable, long-term, and it's unrestricted. That's like the holy grail for managers. And it's something that all too few of us have actually achieved. So when we sent out a pre-survey to some of the managers in the workshop today, it actually came as no surprise to me that the top desired capacity building need is sustainable financing. And I'm delighted that we can do all this great work with sharing experiences and training and technical support, but also financing. It's great that we're able to work on that. And we have worked on it a lot since MPAConnect has existed. Dana showed this actually earlier in the day in the welcome, which I joined for too. We are working hard behind the scenes to access more funding for the network, in part to enable you to do follow-up, small grant, follow-up projects based on what you're learning today and what you'll learn this week, to work on stony coral tissue loss disease. But at the same time, we want to build your capacity to be sufficient and successful, self-sufficient and successful in financing your coral rescue work. So I have 10 lessons about financing mechanisms, and I have 10 tools or resources that I want to share with you. This comes from our past work since 2011. We've held 2 regional learning exchanges that have been fully focused on sustainable financing for Caribbean MPAs. We've funded and we've helped to implement now 16 site-specific projects on sustainable financing. And we've brought some really concerted mentoring effort to coral reef managers in our network, all under the good technical guidance of experts in the topic. So, number 1 on this list, as inspiring as it is when you hear somebody has had success with an idea, it's not just a matter of replicating the same mechanisms that have worked for others. Selecting successful and implementing successful financing mechanisms requires an understanding of the unique context for your work. So to tell you a quick story, in about 2016, Roatan Marine Park were really keen to replicate Tide Belize's successful Ridge to Reef expeditions program. That's a financing mechanism that involves paying volunteers helping with monitoring work. But Roatan Marine Park quickly realised that the key elements of the mechanism in Belize just didn't match well with what they had to work with on Roatan in order to be able to host volunteers and make a profit. So they quickly pivoted and looked at what could work. How did they do this? Well, they used the first tool that I'm going to offer to you, which is called the Eco-2-Fin model. Now, it might look terrible here, but starting at the top, the model guides you through a context analysis to assess the ecosystem services, the benefits, the decision makers associated with your work in order to then identify possible flows of funding. With the help of a SWOT analysis, the next step in this model is then to identify potential obstacles to getting the streams of funding flowing, or to consider possible feasible interventions to overcome those obstacles. The Eco-2-Fin model was helpful in the case of Roatan Marine Park all those years ago. They'd already developed a successful bracelet program in return for donations from divers. And after considering how many cruise ship passengers were benefiting from their coral reefs, they did some calculations about the potential return from scaling up the bracelet program from divers to cruise ship passengers, and they found that there were easy gains to be made and that they could overcome a couple of easy obstacles and start to generate more funding by expanding that existing financing mechanism. So our second lesson is to consider your existing financing mechanisms and look at how you can strengthen or expand those to now also address coral rescue. Let's think about, though, identifying new financing mechanisms that might be relevant in the context of your work. Well, lesson number 3 is that it will likely take a number of different financing mechanisms to fund coral rescue, as Alizé mentioned. So here's an overview of different types of financing mechanisms that we work with a lot. This is produced by our friends at Wolf's Company, our experts in financing. Now, if I ask you, how do you think you might fund coral rescue? I bet a lot of you are thinking first of grants, right? Now, grants are, of course, more than welcome, and they're a really important part of the financing picture. But given their competitive nature, the finite timing they work with, the fixed deliverables, they're not a truly sustainable financing mechanism. So what you might focus on instead is developing a strong relationship with your local conservation trust funds. There's actually a lot of funding. Ooh, that's interesting. There's actually a lot of funding that's being channeled to focus trust funds, to focus on marine conservation financing through local conservation trust funds. And they're actually then dispersing funds to a range of partners and initiatives. So it really will pay dividends to become a close friend and a trusted partner with your local conservation trust fund. Now, there are a lot of different funds existing in the region, and part of my advice is to get your conservation trust fund manager familiar with not just your work that you're doing, but with your budget that you're developing, with your budget needs, and encourage them to do everything to invest in your work for the long term. So in that, I'm talking about a kind of a strategic partnership. And you might actually look for other strategic partnerships, like Alizé mentioned, but it could be with the private sector, with research institutions or relevant government agencies. Part of this is lesson 5, that cost effectiveness and cost efficiencies that you can get through partnerships are a really valid and a really important part of your sustainable financing picture. So that's something to really think about. Lesson 6 is that we've learned that raising sustainable financing requires creative solutions that are tailored to your context. You might also consider things like reef adoption programs, symbolic adoption, to raise donations. You might promote those through social media. You could host a sponsored event, a social event for donors. You could invite paying volunteers to help with your work. You could charge an entry fee to your facilities, or you could sell some cool merchandise. There are also innovative mechanisms too that we hope will help with sustainable marine financing in the future. There are things like, debt for nature swaps, insurance, bonds, and impact investment. And I'm hoping that Scott Winters from the Coral Restoration Foundation might be in the room with you, and he'll be able to share more in the breakout session about impact investment, albeit where investors are looking for returns. As Alizé said, there are really creative ways to go into financing, and I'd encourage you to really think creatively outside the box and come up with something new, because this list certainly didn't include cocktails and conservation, but it certainly could. Now, to help you explore different financing mechanisms that are known about, I have 2 resources to suggest to you. The first one is the BioFin Catalogue of Financing Solutions. It's a UNDP tool, and it has a searchable database with good information on all sorts of financing mechanisms. You can complement this with another searchable catalogue of case studies, the Panorama Solutions database from Jeff and GIZ. And as you can see from Alizé's work, there are great examples in our region, and you might find some of them on Panorama, and you can also come to MPAConnect, and we have some other creative solutions that are developing in the region. So are you starting to get some ideas about possible finance mechanisms? But we're not done yet, because once you identify the mechanisms, the next step is to screen them against selection criteria and prioritize them for implementation. Now, at MPAConnect, we use these sort of criteria that I'm showing on the screen here. We're looking for the financial impact of the mechanism. We're looking for the ease of implementation. We're hoping that there's good likelihood of success. And now the COVID experience has taught us that we also need to look for resilient financing mechanisms. And that's lesson number 7. This means that we're looking for diverse funding mechanisms. We're looking for predictable income and flexibility in using the funding. Now, a fundamental part of deciding which mechanism to implement is the extent to which it will close the funding gap that you have. Now, do you know how much it's going to cost to implement the coral rescue methods that you're looking at? Good financial management begins with taking the time and the effort to build a budget. We have a budget template that we use with MPA managers, and that might be useful for you as an idea to how to develop your coral rescue budget, should you need that help. The first step is to arm yourself, though, with your coral rescue plan. Then you need to identify the activities and the sub-activities, and those become the rows of your budget. You need to forecast out the annual costs associated with each budget item, and those become those give you your costs, your quantities, and the formulae to put in the rows here. Now, for each, we identify also the categories into which each budget item falls, whether it's personnel, consumables, equipment or infrastructure, contracts, or travel. And for each budget item, we indicate the amount of funding secured and the amount remaining to be raised. And you can then look at which activities and which categories have the biggest gaps. From the budget template, we create an overview page that clearly shows the forecast needs and the gaps of fundraising. And this could be quite powerful for you in terms of coral rescue financial planning, taking into account that it's quite a long-term, multi-year programmatic effort. We tend to recommend forecasting budgets like this out 3 years, maybe 5 years, depending on your chosen coral rescue approach. Now, depending on the particular mechanism you select, there are other planning tools to know about which can help you to build a roadmap for financing for coral rescue. Lesson number 8 is that this work all requires that you do go into some depth. For example, we've done feasibility analyses, and we've done this sort of financial modeling to look at the return on investment, especially in the case of enterprise-related ideas. We've also then developed business plans, and the business plans, we've used the business model canvas. This is a really helpful tool that everyone working on financing ideas loves. It's a way to think through your financing idea. There's a related tool called the value proposition canvas, which can help you with positioning your financing idea and determining how to market it in terms of the gains it makes for the beneficiaries and the pains that it can relieve. That's another good tool to just be aware of. Now, this links with your communications, and communications is just an essential part of sustainable financing. That's lesson number 9. We've learned that to develop strategic communications that are going to target the right message at the right audience, there's this tool that we like at MPAConnect called the message box tool. It's a handy single-page tool. It helps you look at your problem, or in this case, to look at your financing need for coral rescue and to determine the right messaging to position it to your target audience. Then when it comes to communications, of course, social media is really important. And we've learned that there's an art and there's perhaps a science to communicating, and especially for making an effective call to action for fundraising. Making the call to action. We actually did an MPAConnect webinar on this topic. There are some great examples on social media to follow, and someone in the room who'll be able to point you to Instagram, where you can follow some concerted effort that's being made to link social media with fundraising at Roatan Marine Park. some of you have noticed on the program at Reef Futures that there are actually two communication sessions that were happening in tandem with our workshop today. And so I checked in with the facilitators of those sessions about their content because I didn't want you to miss out on that. Now, in the first one of the communications sessions, the Blue Frontiers campaign was going to be talking about, was going to be doing training on talking to the media. And essentially, what they were doing in their session was talking about how to change from communicating in a scientific way, where you think about explaining the methods, the results, the next research questions, to instead telling a story and telling a story with passion. Okay, so that was the essence of the first session. Then the second session by the Olapi Creative is applying a method or an approach developed by a fellow called Randy Olson. And it's quite well known. It's called the and, but, and therefore approach to storytelling. They were going to apply that particularly to video. Now, they summarize the approach as being that first you set the scene, then you introduce some conflict, and then thirdly, you provide the resolution. So an example of doing that would be to say, well, there are 350 miles of coral reef off Florida's east coast, and it's an incredible resource, but it's dying. Therefore, smart people from around the world are gathering to figure out how best to save Florida's and the world's coral reefs this week at Reef Futures. The last lesson that I'm going to tell you is we've learned that coral reef managers really need to be the ones who drive the process of financial planning and communications, and who need to be involved in all the aspects of budgeting and financial work and communications. It's really not something that we've seen successfully delegated to consultants, although of course some technical assistance and some mentoring can help you with working through these steps. But you know your corals, you know the work that you want to do, and you really know your local context best. There are no shortcuts, but there are tools, and there is a tried and a tested pathway that I hope I've offered you that you can follow. As you can see with Alizé, we're seeing that our managers are having success in raising sustainable financing for their work, and I know you too can do it. Thanks from the team at MPAConnect.